This is another really important concept in water transport in vascular plants, and that's the cohesion tension theory. This is the consensus theory for how water transport occurs in vascular plants. Back in the 19th century, there were a lot of working hypotheses for how water transport in xylem might work. And in the early 20th century, cohesion tension sort of arose as the leading theory or hypothesis. And I think has settled into the role of theory, where there's a lot of data supporting this mechanism. As I mentioned before, occasionally there are challenges to the cohesion tension hypothesis or theory. Sometimes because people have a hard time accepting the existence of liquid water in a metastable or negative pressure state in xylem, which is necessary for cohesion tension to work. But for the most part, physiologists working in water relations agree that this is how it happens. So there's a few tenets of the cohesion tension theory that also explain how it works. And one is that there's a continuous column of water from the roots to point of evaporation in the leaves. In other words, there's a continuous and uninterrupted chain of water from the root surface all the way through the roots, through the xylem and the stem, through branches, into the leaf veins, and into the cell walls of mesophyll cells where the evaporation into the intercellular spaces of leaves actually occurs. That's a continuous column or rope of water. Another important point is that there is cohesion between water molecules. Since water is polar. And what I mean by that is the molecular structure of water looks something like this, where this is the oxygen atom, and these are the two hydrogen atoms. So this molecule is polar in that there's a slight positive charge on this side of the molecule and a slight negative charge on this side of the molecule, because the positive valences of hydrogen are over on one side and the negative valence of oxygen's the other side. And what that does is that means that water molecules tend to stick to each other like this. So that net positive on one side is attracted to the net negative of the other side of the next molecule, and they tend to stick together. That sticking together is called cohesion, and it's pretty strong. Water is quite a polar molecule. That's also what makes water a really good solute. It's because that polar nature can pull other molecules apart and dissolve them. It also means we have surface tension in water, which is a special attribute of water, and that's because water is polar. Okay, so cohesion occurs, water molecules stick together. Third, there is tension or negative pressure develops due to evaporation of water from leaf mesophyll cell walls. And I'll elaborate on this in a minute. So in other words, that evaporation generates a pulling force. Okay? That pulling force pulls the water column upward. Okay, so there's a continuous column of water. The molecules in that water column stick together. As water evaporates from the cell walls, that generates a pulling force that pulls the water column up the tree. Okay? One special note, water flow is not due to capillary forces in xylem conduits. It was thought for some time that perhaps capillary forces were what caused the rise in water in sap. So when I say that, what I mean is that if you place a narrow tube into water, because of its polar nature, will stick to the edges of that container and flow upward in that tube a little bit. That's called capillary rise. And it's just due to the attraction of those polar water molecules to the walls of the tube. If you get your finger pricked for a blood test, sometimes they'll take a little glass capillary tube and touch it to the drop of blood on your finger, and the blood runs up that capillary tube. That's due to capillary forces. Capillary forces are a function of the narrowness of the container. So the more narrow the container, the stronger that pulling force due to capillary forces. But xylem conduits are only narrow enough to pull water upward about a meter. Okay, so capillary forces could in, for instance, tracheids, could account for pulling water up maybe a meter. Okay, so we know that this flow of water through a xylem of a tall tree is not due to capillary forces in the xylem. So tracheids, the narrowest tubes, for instance, are not narrow enough to generate sufficient capillary force to cause that. Okay, so I just told you that capillary forces in xylem conduits are not the source of the pull that moves water by cohesion tension. I don't want to confuse you, but capillary forces are the source of pull when we're talking about the capillary forces in mesophyll cell walls. So capillary forces in mesophyll, so I'll say leaf mesophyll cell walls do generate the pulling force that drives cohesion tension. And here's how it works. This is a great diagram from the Graham et al. Plant Phys book. So we're looking at, this is a cross section of a leaf, and we're going to zoom in really close. So here's a cross section of the leaf. Okay, we're going to zoom in on some mesophyll cells. Okay, so that's the zoom. Each of these is a mesophyll cell with the intercellular spaces of the leaf. Okay, now we're going to zoom in even further just on the cell wall of one mesophyll cell. Okay, this is the cell wall right here of the mesophyll cell. And it should look familiar. I've showed you images of cell walls, which are just a bunch of cellulose microfibrils laid down across each other to make that cell wall. Okay, now we're zooming in even more. Here we're zooming in and showing just 2 cellulose microfibrils where they cross in that cell wall. Those 2 cellulose microfibrils make a little pocket. Basically, you can think of this as a little container, almost like a little tube where water is. So when water evaporates from a mesophyll cell into the intercellular space, it's basically evaporating from the cell wall from in between those cellulose microfibrils. As that water evaporates from those cellulose microfibrils, it forms a meniscus. So this curvature between the cellulose microfibrils is a meniscus that's caused by the clinging of those water molecules to the cellulose microfibrils. Just like water in a capillary tube clings to the walls of that tube, the water clings to the sides of those cellulose microfibrils. And the more the water evaporates, the steeper that curve becomes. So as more water evaporates, the radius of curvature of that water, of that meniscus, becomes steeper and the pulling force becomes stronger. This meniscus generates the capillary pulling force. And because this is such a small container, it's like a tiny, tiny tube. Orders of magnitude, these distances are orders of magnitude smaller than, for instance, the smallest tracheate. Cellulose microfibrils are microscopic, right? They're at the molecular level. So these are very small tubes, and that means that meniscus can generate very strong pulling force. This is looking at different radius of curvature. This is a huge pulling force. So these pulling forces can be very large. So this is the point. That point of evaporation is where that pulling force gets generated. So it's really important to distinguish this capillary force that's basically between cellulose microfibrils in the mesophyll cell wall, to distinguish that from any capillary forces that exist in, for instance, xylem conduits. They're different. This is the place where the pulling force for cohesion tension is generated.